in this class we're going to unapologetically concentrate on multiple choice items, and there is a particular reason for this. As you're probably aware, the multiple choice item is endemic in all educational assessment, and indeed beyond educational assessment. It's common in questionnaire design, in surveys, even in interviewing people who are given multiple choice questions. These are closed response items. Now, the MC item has its origins now over 100 years ago in the work of an educationist called Kelly, and he works at the University of Kansas. And if you use your phone or other device to scan the code on the screen now, you will download a copy of Kelly. If you find that doesn't work at the moment, it is quite a substantial document. I'm afraid I had to scan it and create a PDF. You can always come back and scan it again at a later date. The origins were in the First World War, and Kelly had created the item around 1914 to have more efficient, quick, easily scoreable reading tests for his university. And during the First World War, when the first very large-scale tests of English were developed, what we now know as the Army Beta test, which was designed to assess the language capabilities of non-English speaking conscripts into the army in the First World War, to discover whether or not they needed to be assigned to a language battalion to improve their English, or whether or not they were ready for active service. And the multiple choice item was obvious from the start as the item of choice. They tested 1.7 million men in 1917. There was an individual test as well, but they used that merely to see whether or not the scores on the individual test correlated well with the scores on the group multiple choice test. They did, and so they went with the multiple choice test. And ever since then, the multiple choice item has been endemic throughout all of testing and assessment. They're difficult to write, actually, but they're cheap and easy to deliver and score. And most importantly, they provide many, many points of information. We've talked about reliability in previous classes. Reliability increases the more items you have on a test. So if you only have 2 or 3 performance tasks, the reliability is almost inevitably lower than it is with many, many multiple choice items. That doesn't mean to say the multiple choice items produce the most valid test, and herein lies a problem. But the actual how we calculate reliability, how we look at it, that's a topic for language testing and assessment too. So I hope you've managed to download that, but please read it. You don't have time to read it now, but please read it at your leisure after this class. Okay, so let's have a look at the item writing process. The first thing to say is that item writing is not something we just sit down and do. It's a one-off. It is a process, and it's an iterative process during which we, first of all, obviously use our test spec. And we take something like the pop and spec, which we talked about last time, the template. and we produce the general description or the definition of the construct that we're interested in, relevant to the domain of interest to which we want to make predictions. We then look at issues of content as well as construct before we start the item writing process. If it's a reading test, we also have to look at what kind of text we need and so on. But the multiple choice item itself, these are the key issues in the item writing process that I've put up here. Ensure the key is the only correct answer. No option longer or more complex than others. We try to randomize options so that there is some kind of grammatical or lexical balance. We don't want any lexical clues from the prompt. We always avoid words like always or never because they're unlikely to be true, and learners learn to avoid those. And most critical of all, we mustn't have any inter-option or inter-item dependence. Now, what that means is that if a learner answers a particular way to one item, it should not influence the way they respond to another item. If we have inter-item dependence, it can inflate or indeed depress the score. And we wish to avoid this at all cost. Now, I have created a podcast that explains this in more detail, and you can see on the screen that I have the link to the web page on my website. So the web page that I just showed you has all the generic information on how to produce good multiple choice item types. And again, more work has gone into the qualities of good multiple choice items than of any other test format. Now, as I mentioned earlier, item review is an iterative process. So we look at an item once it's been written to a spec, and we review it. And we ask questions like, does it fit the spec? Does it assess what we intended it to assess? And so on. And because of this iterative review process before an item is accepted for use, remember the quality control procedures that we talked about, we use item review forms which list the kind of things that we're looking for. Again, please scan the barcode now and download the example of a generic item review form to your mobile device. And if you'd like to have a look at that, I will talk you through it. So on your separate device now, you should have the item review form, which you downloaded from my website. And you can see that this is a fairly typical standard review form. At the top, it says item type. So that, you know, it's not just for multiple choice. You can use it for gap filling, for short answer responses, whatever. And then we've got review fields. A plus, a tick or a cross. Does it meet it? Meet the requirement? And a box for you to record concerns or suggestions. Now this would go back to the item writer for review, and it would be only when item reviewers have a column full of ticks and no more concerns or suggestions that the item would actually go for piloting. So the top is item spec and congruence. Will this item elicit a response that tests one of the key skills listed in the specifications, or as I would call them, constructs? Okay, then you've got the key check. Remember, the key is the correct response. The item that is supposed to be correct. The other three options are the distractors. So we ask the question, is it the only correct response? And does the key have all of these features? We then ask the questions about the distractors. I've seen many multiple choice items where the distractors just aren't grammatically correct. And so it's frequently the case that the option that is correct is the one without any errors in it. Notice as well we've got things like make sure it's free of emotive words. One of the things I mentioned earlier, things like all, every, and so on, and avoid all of the above. Okay. Make sure that the items are independent. Yep, no inter-item dependency, and make sure that all the distractors are plausible. Okay. We don't really want distractors that are not plausible in the context, because then no one will be distracted by them. And that's the nature of a distractor. It shouldn't be correct, but it should be plausible. Then we've got an estimate of difficulty. Estimating difficulty of items is hugely complex. Remember the video that you saw with Professor Bernard Spolsky right back in the first class for validity, and he said that one of the things that's incredibly difficult to do is to estimate difficulty, but there are some things we can look at to do this. Items are only tested for difficulty once they get to pilot stage, and we're going to come to that in a moment. Okay, so check the vocabulary, check the syntax, make sure the question's identifiable. We then have issues of bias or sensitivity. Is there anything in the item or task that is going to disadvantage anyone by a protected characteristic? And make sure that whatever the content is, it's going to be familiar to all test takers. This is a problematic one. Many of you who are familiar with the big international tests have probably often criticise them on the grounds that the content is bland. It's just not terribly interesting. But this is the reason why. You have to have something that is not going to give topical or knowledge advantages to some of the test takers. That's also the reason why in a general academic English test like IELTS, you don't have topics that are on a particular discipline. They're texts of general academic interest. And then you've got your editorial review. Okay, so this is a generic review form, and in one of the tasks I'm going to ask you to do in a little while, I'd like you to come back to this form and use it, and maybe even adapt it when you come to some of the reviews that you do yourself. Okay, here's an example of how items go through iterations. And I'm going to show you these fairly quickly just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that happens. Now, this is a real example of an item that was written for a listening test. And as you can see, it's looking at interactions, fairly straightforward interactions on the telephone, and it's being written for a business English context. And this was designed by one of my doctoral students, actually, who was given the task of designing a business English listening test. One of the domains was telephone conversations, and this was one of the items drafted. And this is a first draft. So you can see that we have In the spec, it would say that there are two utterances, one from someone telephoning to the company and one from the person who answers the phone, the telephonist of the company. And what they have to do is select the most appropriate response to the second utterance of the telephonist. Now, in this particular case, what happens is you've got sure, I'll in all of them. If you're going to have the same beginning in each, then you put it in the response. You don't repeat the first bit in every single response. It's just not necessary. And then we've got pass, tell, pass. Pass with on, of course. Tell then with her. The use of the word appreciation is problematic, and it appears twice. In C, it's much longer, and what happened here was this distractor, because it was longer, tended to distract too many people, even though it said to Joe, and the person making the telephone conversation is Joe. The first two, with I'll pass on the copies and I'll try to send the copies, in this environment were not as popular. There are problems with this, and I actually have a problem with the word appreciation as well. You have to know the meaning of the word appreciation, and the link with yes, thanks. Right, moving on to the second draft of this, you can see it's changed a bit. The length of the options have got much closer to each other. There's an attempt to split up the sure and the okay at the beginning. We've still got a problem with I'll tell, I'll ask and pass. We've got two tells there. Might need to look at that, but it depends on final piloting. I'm not too worried about that. And we've still got the word appreciation. And I'll just comment on this word appreciation now. It's the most complex word that we've got in this question. And if you have one complex word, and there aren't any complex words anywhere else, especially if you don't know what appreciation means, then you're likely to select that. This second draft wasn't accepted. It went back again to review, and it went through a third iteration, and the third iteration was considered to be much, much better. And here's the final sample, item sample 1, the final version, and this was considered to be okay. You see now A and C are okay. The tell is, one of them is with the okay and one is with the sure. That's now fine. We've got the most important thing is that the appreciation has gone completely. So now the key is B. Sure, I'll let her know you said so. Now this was sent out for piloting, and a pilot is when we give sample items to groups of students drawn from the sample population, preferably larger groups, so that we can do some statistical analysis. And we've got now the statistical analysis that goes with this item sample on the screen. I'll just go through each of the sections. First of all, we've got the rate for selecting each option. And of course, this is just the percentage of people that responded to each option. Now, in applied linguistics and language testing, when we're dealing with quantitative data, we always represent things as decimal points, and then we move the decimal place 2 spaces to the right to turn it into a percentage. So for A, it's 0.04, which means 4% of the test takers answered A. B, which is the key, 0.67, which means that 67% of the test takers answered B. For C, it was 22%, and for D, it was 7%. So C is kind of distracting more than A and D, but A and D are distracting a significant number of the test takers. Now, the level of difficulty is essentially the overall percentage of the population who answered the question correctly. And as B is correct, it's the same as the second entry in column 1, which is 0.67. Sometimes we call this the facility index or the item difficulty. So sometimes it's called ID or facility value or facility index. And all it is the proportion of people answering the item correctly. The next one, discrimination. You'll remember a couple of classes back I told you that discrimination in testing, discrimination is the one place where discrimination is still good. What we're doing is separating the better students from the weaker students. In this case, what we do, a rough guide to this is we take the top third of the students, the bottom third of the students, and then we work out what percentage of the top minus the bottom got the question correct. And this is the discrimination level between the better and the weaker students. Normally, if the value of this is 1, which is the highest it can possibly be, that means all of the better students got it correct, and all of the weaker students got it incorrect. Now in this case, 0.77, which means it's working pretty well. It's separating out the better and the weaker students to a very large degree. All of these statistics are great, and it means that this would probably survive the piloting and it would end up in the final listening test. So that's an example of the way in which you'd go through this, and you would use something like the template I've already shown you to make notes on items like this and give feedback to the writers. Okay, so the item review process, it's iterative, and you saw the video before the class in which Charlie Stansfield, who is a real expert in this, talked about the different stages. We do it at every step, but once an item finishes the final review, in other words, there's nothing left to see, then it goes on to piloting and has a chance of getting into the final test. And he summarised this: key check, difficulty discrimination, which is what we just talked about, bias sensitivity review, which is on the form, and editorial review. But what we're going to do now, having just summarised that from the review process, we're going to go on and look at bias sensitivity next. Now, this particular diagram you have seen before. I showed it to you. But we look at bias and test methods for at-risk groups. And at-risk groups are, sometimes we call them DSIs, or designated subgroups of interest. So we could, for example, designate a subgroup of interest as, I'll take the disability example from bias, people who have visual impairment. And we may look at the design of the items, the font sizes and so on, and the colour schemes to see whether or not there is anything in there that is likely to disadvantage that particular group of people. So this is bias, okay? And again, we've seen this particular diagram before, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But this is particularly important in item review. Now, again, we have guidelines that we can use. The kinds of questions in this case that we ask in order to decide whether or not there's any bias in an item. Now, if you scan the code there again, you will see that I've got sample bias questions, which come from a paper by Hamilton, Ronald, and Rogers. Item bias review from Practical Language Assessment, and I've given you the reference there. This is an online journal, and these are some of the questions that they suggest that bias reviewers look at. Notice they use the terminology DSI here, which I just explained, and these are some of the questions that they would ask. What I'd like you to do with this, and this is a task that I'll ask you to do afterwards, after the class, and maybe we can discuss it at some point, is, do you think that these are reasonable? Imagine a particular group of people who you think tests may be biased against, and then go through and look at these questions and say, would these be a suitable guide to finding the biases for a group that you can imagine? If not, would you take anything away? Would you add to these? How would you revise these questions? The next download for you when you scan this code is for you to put into practice the item review form and the bias questionnaire to evaluate problems with the items in the Spot the Mess handout. Now, in the handout, all of the items in here are real items from real tests that have been collected over the years. And the first one, actually, is from an educational institution, but I won't tell you which one it is. What I would like you to do is to go through those questions and see if you can use the review form and the bias questions to see if there are any issues in here, and how you might advise item reviewers either to change them or just to ditch the items completely at the initial review stage because you don't think that anything can be done with them. Right, moving on to the next one, which is practice in item writing. And if we were in a class, then this is something we would do in groups within a classroom setting. We don't have that luxury at the moment. So what I'm going to ask you to do is look at the handout on reading constructs, and that's what you get when you click on the when you download by scanning the barcode, and you'll get a set of reading constructs from the work of Grabe and Stoller. Bill Grabe is one of the foremost reading researchers in the world at the moment, and he's produced a number of books, most notably the long-run book with Frederica Stoller entitled Teaching and Researching Reading, and this is from this book. So if you just want to, I hope you've downloaded this now, and if you just want to skim through it, you can see we've got classify information, the ability to compare and contrast, considering an author's point of view, consider vocabulary, looking at causal relations, cause and effect, how to generalize, the ability to identify main ideas and sequences, indication of sequence, making connections, judgments, prediction, and showing understanding of grammatical relations. Now, I would like you to select just one construct from those that you would like to test. I would like you to select a short reading text, and let's say that this is a general reading subtest from an examination, something like the first certificate in English or the preliminary English test, something like that. But try to specify what the difficulty level is, who the learners might be. It's very difficult to construct any kind of test unless we know who we're constructing it for. So try to be clear about that and select a suitable test. And then design just 1 or 2 items to accompany the short text that are going to test the construct from our reading list, from our construct list from Grave and Stoller. Then for the items you've constructed, they're going to be sample items. Complete a specification form so that other people could produce similar items of the same construct to a similar level difficulty. And then last but not least, use the item review and bias forms to check that your items are suitable for the intended population. Now that's an activity for you to do, and you'll see that when you do this, everything will start to come together. That you identify your constructs, you go through a process of designing and constructing parts of a test which can then be added together with others using the assembly model that you produce to create a reading test for the intended audience. So that's another activity that I would like you to do after this class. And produce that on maybe just one piece of A4.